No question. No question. And thank you for making the point that when we think about homelessness, most people identify it with the person that they've seen who's unhoused, visibly unhoused on the sidewalk. When the truth is that the vast majority of people who are homeless in New York are living in shelter, and a third of them are working. That's what we're going to get into a little bit today, especially with Chris Quinn and family homelessness. Shane, people are very, very interested to know what the city is doing about the homelessness crisis. And I was hoping you could talk for a few minutes about what the Adams administration's approach is towards this crisis.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Councilmember, and thank you to the other panelists and for everybody for joining us. No, absolutely. Overall, I'd say that, the mayor's approach and the administration's approach right now is to really strengthen and build upon and expand upon the existing work and the resources to further close the gaps, but also, as Jacquelyn pointed out, recognizing that after years of neglect and disinvestment in our social infrastructure, we have to make some pretty big investments, key and historical investments, to build the pathways and connections, to drive us to the next level of reductions. I mean, I should just say, the solution to addressing the problem of unsheltered individuals living on the streets, experiencing, long-term homelessness is connection. Ideally that's to getting them inside, but connecting them to services, to treatment, to care, to permanent housing, and ensuring that people have access is really essential, and giving us the tools. So, the mayor has made it pretty clear that we have a moral duty and obligation to do better and to break these cycles. He's said many times it's cruel and inhumane to abandon people to life on the streets. So, what that means for us is, in the short term, investment in people, getting more people out on the streets to make those connections. And certainly in the medium to kind of longer term is obviously housing. Everybody recognizes that as a factor, and also, policy changes, again, just giving us the tools to get people inside more quickly. From this administration, everything has really been holistic and integrated. The goal has been to streamline and, accelerate any processes we have to get agencies working together in a way we haven't in previous administrations in years past, to just ensure that anybody on the street in distress or in crisis are connected to all the available resources, be they DHS, H&H, DOHMH, whatever the case is, local service providers who don't have city contracts, whatever the case is, the goal is to connect with them. And, obviously making sure all of it is done with compassion and care. So, coming from the street side, I can certainly go into the shelter side, but just to give everybody, I suppose I should just give a very crude and broad overview. Fundamentally, the way we're addressing street homelessness, there's sort of two ways. There's outreach, and then there's housing. The city contracts out with nonprofit providers. For those on the, who are watching this who don't know, each borough has one nonprofit that's responsible for providing 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, 365 days a year, homeless outreach. Hurricanes, COVID, whatever the case is, they have teams in the field engaging everybody they know to be homeless or believed to be homeless or receive reports about being homeless. And these teams, there's a lot of metrics, there's a lot of performance measures, there's a lot of work they do, but fundamentally everything is oriented and framed around housing, getting people inside. And really the sole job of these outreach teams is to build the connections with people, build the trust, to get at those barriers that are preventing somebody from coming inside, or building the trust to make them less hesitant to come inside. And then, like I said, housing, in the Street Homeless Solutions Unit, so we're the unit that, again, is responsible for all the individuals who are on the street or the subways. We've developed this model called transitional housing. So these are what you hear of historically as the safe havens, drop-in centers, and stabilization beds. Fundamentally, what these are low barrier settings that are designed for street homeless individuals to meet the unique needs that street homeless individuals present with and come with. What this means is that these are sites that tend to be smaller than shelters. tend to have lower numbers of people per room, have the staff have smaller caseloads, smaller sites, different rules. They do not have curfew. Clients can come and go as they please. They can leave sites for up to 72 hours or more. And everything from the case management down to the intake process is really designed to work at the client's pace. So somebody can come in, and that intake process can be days or hours or weeks, whatever the case is, to help us provide an environment where people feel safe and comfortable and supported so they can stabilize and get the help, get connected to the help they need, and then eventually move on to permanent housing. And I can certainly go into what those look like. But those are safe havens, just crudely safe havens. Safe havens are, tend to be for individuals. They have more clinical resources. These are historically for some of the most entrenched, most vulnerable, chronically street homeless individuals. They have clinical supports on site. They have access to medical care and case management. And again, they're there. These are low barrier settings for street homeless individuals to come inside and get connected. Stabilization beds are sites that are also for street homeless population. They tend to be for individuals who are a bit more independent, who do not need quite that level of support, mental health support or medical support that someone may need in a safe haven, but they still have case management on site, housing specialists, and the goal still there is still to get people into permanent housing. Drop-in centers are literally, and as you mentioned, the 14th Street Center, drop-in centers are places for people to come inside. Similar model, low barrier, low threshold. There's no preconditions for coming inside. These are places for people just to get in, out of the elements. People who may not want to commit to a bed, may not want to be involved in any work with the teams, be involved in case management, may not want housing, but they do just want to come inside, and they can get showers or food or access to case management and access to clinical services. And then further access to housing. But these are just places for anyone to come in off the street and literally just come in. They can stay as long as they want or as short as they want, but just a safe place for them to come inside and access the services.
So Shane, just to put this in some context for people.
Yeah.
Historically, the homeless, the street outreach workers, they would refer people to the shelter system. And historically, the shelter system has been these large shelters like the Bellevue shelter on the east side and around the city. And you would go to the intake, they would go to the intake center, and they would get a referral to go to another shelter elsewhere in the city that same night. What the outreach workers have found to be a huge challenge is that people who are living on the street don't want to necessarily go to those shelters. They've been to those shelters. They don't feel safe. They're not a place where they want to be. So they're not going to go back. So the administration, the previous administration and this administration has really been trying to increase the other options in the toolkit for these outreach workers, because they're going up to folks on the street all day long and saying, hey, come with me and we'll get you a meal, get you a shower, get you a bed. They historically haven't had enough options for people. So creating a safe haven where it's closer to where they are, it's smaller, ideally it has a room with a door that can lock. These are the kind of tools that outreach workers can use to be successful. Because one thing that I've heard is that you've got outreach workers, they could be there all day long, talking to people all day, but if they don't have things to offer, they're wasting their time.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, transitional housing is an essential tool, essential resource. And part of it is, addressing the needs and addressing, hearing out the clients and providing them what they need and what they want. And so if clients, the outreach teams are able to get clients directly in, there is no intake process. The intake process is the work with the outreach teams and the back and forth and finding out with the outreach teams, discussing in real time where you want to go, what you feel comfortable with. Not every placement works the first time. Sometimes it's a second time, the third time, and always having that option to stay within the portfolio and go to different sites at different times. And having those saying, I can bring you to a bed right now. That is it. And one of the things we've started under this administration is something it's sort of in between, is called a welcome center. So a welcome center is kind of programmatically like a stabilization bed, but a welcome center is a site for individuals we may be engaging at 2 a.m. at the subways or on the street, who again they don't really want a stabilization bed. They don't want a safe haven. They might not want to be there long term, but they don't want a drop-in center. But a welcome center is a place they can come inside, get a bed, get access to services, medical care, clinical care, and then kind of build that trust with the teams while they're inside. And while they're there, the goal being it's this kind of short-term placement. From there, they can figure out a better place for them to be, or a different place, I should say, a safe haven, a more appropriate safe haven or stabilization bed. So that's a kind of midpoint, a kind of pre-assessment. But again, the goal is immediate. I'm talking to you at 3 a.m. on the subway, and you say you want to come inside, or you're kind of hesitant about coming inside. These are things I have to offer you right now. So that's certainly something that has started under this administration. And I'll go through, some of the other things that have happened, under this administration. Public and private partnerships have been something that's been new that we've done a lot of. The partnership for New York City has started continued with breaking ground the Homeless Assistance Fund, and I think it's expansion of the Connect to Care program, which Breaking Ground has been doing, running in Midtown for quite a while. So this is a public-private partnership with a nonprofit provider, Breaking Ground, to provide additional resources and services to clients. They've added outreach teams that allow the program allows them to go into ATMs and retail spaces, and they're targeting transportation hubs and office districts. And then these outreach teams, more boots on the ground, more services, more ways to connect to get more people inside who we may not have gotten historically, particularly in retail spaces and some of these ATMs. Another private partnership, which is a similar vein, is the SHAP, which is the Street Homeless Advocacy Project, and it's run by Norman Siegel and Robert Hayes, and the Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing. NILAG and Doe Fund are involved. And what this is this is a volunteer initiative that's developed to directly support the homeless individuals on the street. So they recruit and then train volunteers to go out and engage directly individuals living on the streets and connect with them on a sustained basis. They're consistently going out there every week, engaging and supporting these individuals and help building the trust and connecting them to the services. They work as well they partner with DHS. So we have DHS teams going out with them every Thursday night when they go out and engage people, and are building the trust and showing them that they have access to these alternative settings. And these are kind of value add programs that are building on and augmenting the work of the outreach teams. But
that's great, Shane, because people want to be part of the solution, and for a long time, there's been a real challenge in giving people ways to help.
Yeah.
And I'm really encouraged by the idea of this volunteer outreach program, and we're going to be sending out more information about this to everyone.
Yeah, should be in the chat. We should.
There's an initial email and phone number, and we'll be in touch about that more. Shane, why is it that people I hear all the time, they don't see the outreach workers out there. They don't see the teams on the street. Why is that? Because the teams are dressed in plain clothes? Why is that?
It sometimes might be, although you're probably seeing the orange jackets. We're beginning to be called the men in orange, the people in orange. It's for a number of reasons. The outreach teams have a lot of ground to cover, and sometimes they're quite strategic in where they go. They have certain clients they want to engage who are at certain parts of the process, and they want to engage them around case management. They may be going to an area primarily in the evening or overnight where they can engage people in more of a kind of private way. It's a little bit different engaging somebody at 11 o'clock at night on 32nd than it is at 11 in the morning, or, so there's that. There's sometimes they are canvassing, and, they're covering the entire city. So not just Broadway and the main thoroughfares. They're going under bridges and out in the highways and deep in the parks. And so, for instance, sometimes during the day, they're doing a lot of joint operations with other agencies. For instance, possibly some of the syringe service programs, and they're just covering a park. and you're doing a lot of really deep work, and then covering, a lot of engagement at night. In the winter, there's certainly, when we get into code blue and code, when the cold weather comes, which is probably coming pretty soon, the outreach teams, there's a lot of emphasis on the overnight work to really engage people, make sure they're safe. They know who's out there, who is really vulnerable, who is really at risk of dying, who they are afraid is not going to make it through the winter. Every single night they're checking on that person and checking on them again and checking on them again. But, part of getting people involved, and I know, people have heard it before, but for homeless outreach, 311 is just a really effective tool. And this is a way to get around that. So it may indeed be the case that we're going to a specific area at 11:30 at night, because that's when historically it's been active, or that's when we know clients. But it might be that the new activity there is happening at 7:30 in the morning. And we might not be seeing it. So what's happening with those 311 calls, it alerts us, hey, there's a condition and we should check on it. But if we get a lot of them, it helps us see the patterns. We start getting pinged. We're getting a lot of calls for Broadway and 86 at 7 a.m. Maybe we should kind of divert resources to that area.
Yep.
So there's kind of an information gathering element too.
Can I just jump in for 1 second?
Of course.
For the folks who are listening or Zooming or whatever, when you call 311, make sure you get your case number or whatever the number is, because that really then helps it proves to the agency you called, because whatever, I may have once or twice said I called 6 times and I only called 3 times. 1 and 2, it helps the agency track it, so that's really, really important. So make sure you get that number and you write it down and you keep it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Thank you, Christina. That's absolutely right. I mean, and it is just real time. These go, you make a 311 call, it goes to the teams and they have it on their phone and they're responding. And absolutely, the numbers help us figure out. And, if it's just an individual, use the words homeless person in need of assistance. If you're on the app or on the call, just to make sure, and that gets routed directly to the outreach teams. But
I'm happy.
I always push the app because it allows you to put a very detailed description.
I was just going to get into that.
And you can always go back and check the status of your report for assistance. They will update. If you ask or allow for updates, you will get a direct update to your phone.
Right.
So, we always, resources are always an issue, but we are expanding. And like I said, part of the mayor's program is a $12 million expansion in outreach services and getting more people out there. But it is strategic in terms of how we go and where we are. So people aren't seen, and we can.
311 is very important. It's something that I was going to ask about during the Q&A, but now that you mention it, I really want to emphasize to everyone the importance of contacting 311. And I do want to show folks the app. This is a 311 app where you can download it on your phone, and it's right here, homeless assistance. And you can indicate where you've seen the person who needs assistance. And Shane, something I get asked a lot that I want you to clarify for folks: when should folks call 311 versus 911? When should they call 311 or just not call 311? A lot of people are confused about that.
911 is for an emergency. If there is somebody in immediate need, you are worried about them in the immediate terms right now. They are walking into the middle of the road and obviously going to get hit, or they're in the middle of a fight, or there's some violent act or something along those lines. Something that is immediate emergency, absolutely, that is a 911 call. A 311 call is, if you're concerned about anybody, you see anybody and you don't know if they're homeless, you don't know, but you're seeing them around a lot, I would err on the side of calling 311. 311 just gets an outreach team out there to begin the discussion, begin talking to them, offering them services, and just, again, trying to connect them. So that's a kind of broad way of putting it, but 311 will get a team. And, there is a clinical element. These are outreach teams that have, a lot of training and a lot of clinical capacity and are very sophisticated and very good at what they do. And they have very sharp assessment skills. And so they know who they're engaging. And if there is somebody who is, in need of further assistance or heightened levels of assistance, they have access to more clinical staff and clinical supports and can do further assessments.
Great.
Get them
So we'll come back to this topic.
Yep.
Chris, people we talked about what the face of homelessness is in New York, and people don't necessarily identify it with children.
No,
Tell us about that.
Yeah, Eric, thank you so much for pulling this panel and all the other panelists and everybody who's paying attention or, Zooming with us. We don't like to think about homeless children, right? I mean, I think it's partially why we don't talk about it enough and why there isn't enough policy about it. We, in fact, have used the term the forgotten face of homelessness to talk about our clients. But the truth is, at different times, 65 to 70% of the people in shelter are families with children. And at Wynn, we house about 12%. We're the largest provider of shelter to homeless families with children in the city, the largest provider of supportive housing, which Jacquelyn spoke of, and it's so important in the state. How many
people, what's the largest? How many people are we talking?
Well, it's about 65 to 70% of all of the people in shelter. We house every night 2,500 families. Right now, within that mix, which I can answer questions about if people want, we have 274 refugee families and 700 refugee children. We have 1,500 units, anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 individuals, half of whom are children. And one of the things that, came out of the lawsuit and the requirement that homeless people be housed is that requirement. But one of the challenges is in a lawsuit, and we all know this from different things we've done, it doesn't say, and they will get exactly X, Y, and Z services, right? So we have, a very significant contract with the city of New York. We run 13 shelters in 4 boroughs. We're soon to open one in Staten Island. They're really excited about it. So I'm going to, no, they're not at all, but nonetheless, we're excited about it. Those contracts basically pay the rent and the Con Ed, et cetera, right? They, and a base level of service, case management. They don't really pay for the full needs of homeless families. As was mentioned before, maybe by you, Eric, or by somebody, a very significant portion, 52% of our homeless mothers are working. And 95% of our families are headed by single women. Because as well as homelessness being a really racist condition, it is a sexist condition as well as poverty is. So at Wynn, we have a holistic wraparound service model called the Way to Win that also, as well as the case managers and the housing coordinators, which the city supports, has income building, job training program, has a camp for summer and all school breaks, a STEAM camp, has after school help, has recreation. We're moving to bring in a domestic violence model because we really want the city's contracts to be the floor and the needs of our clients to be the city. We all be the ceiling to be the needs of our clients. Now we also deliver all of our services, and this is really important right now, particularly with the refugees. And I am concerned that these models, they have the one on Randall's Island and the one they opened in your district, Eric, I believe it is, for families, it's not clear to me in any of the documentation that they've embraced this. We deliver all of our services in a trauma-informed care model. Even our maintenance workers go through that, our security guards go through that, and it really is critical in delivering quality services. One of the biggest indicators for who will end up being a homeless adult is, were they a homeless child? Our goal at Wynn is to break the cycle of homelessness, and that must occur by working with the children. And then Eric, the council member, mentioned the piece of legislation, which Eric has gotten it to have a veto-proof majority. Not that I think the Mayor Adams is going to veto it, but if he does, we got enough people. That piece of legislation will create funding so we have voluntary mental health services in all of the shelters. I have to tell you, and this is not a pleasant story, over the weekend, one of our clients tried to hang herself with a shirt. Now, thankfully, it wasn't a very good plan, But and I'm not saying that that would definitely not have happened, but it's less likely it would have happened. She's okay, thank God, if we had more mental health services. Now, as Eric said, people don't think about homeless families because it's actually a crime to have your child on the street. And I've had very intelligent people say to me, I didn't know there were homeless children. So a great part of tonight, what you all can do is know that. And if you see stories that, should be mentioning homeless families, tweet that out, reach out to the reporters, whomever, because if the reality of homeless families isn't part of the conversation, it'll never be part of the policy response.
Chris, the mental health and shelters, that legislation came out of a panel discussion we did in the spring where you and your staff talked about the fact that families in need of mental health services are referred out to these clinics out in the city, and they very frequently don't make it for a number of reasons. And there's an inability to get those to come to them in the shelters.
I mean, two things. One, those groups are overburdened. I mean, I think Jacquelyn could probably tell you from singles, right? They're just bursting at the seams. We recently did a referral to the floating hospital, which is not a vote anymore, but and they're a great group. They're very good. 3.5 month wait for the intake interview, which we know, that's not really where the healing happens. Just as an example. Two, we know from our clients, if you don't have it in the shelter, they are less likely to participate. I'll just give an example. We have 2 shelters on the same street, down the block, supportive housing. We were doing the COVID shots at the supportive housing. Very few people even went down the block. When we did it in the shelters, people participated. Whatever the psychology is, the services are embraced when they are in the shelter, and that's why that's part of the legislation. And I can't really thank Eric enough for a lot, and I can say even myself, a lot of council members go to panels, right, and go to legislative breakfast and kind of check the box. Eric immediately after our legislative breakfast reached out and said, how do we take care of this? And that's not true of every elected official.
Thank you so much, Chris, and really looking forward to working with you on that legislation and other ways to use the period that people are in shelter as an opportunity to break the cycle of poverty, and instead of just passing them through. Thank you.
And Eric, can I say one more thing? I'm glad you said that, because the average length of stay at Wynn is 15 months. That's a long time. And a lot of good work can happen, but I don't want it to be that long. Now, right now, the first 90 days, those families are in shelter, they can't apply for housing, which I think is just a Giuliani era leftover. You're poor, we're gonna punish you. We're gonna make you uncomfortable and make you earn a benefit. So we are pushing it. Eric, thank you for your support to get the city to eliminate this arbitrary 90-day rule. And especially because there is such a shortage of housing, let's start looking on day one and put more effort into finding housing so we can get people out of shelter more quickly. Because look, I think Wynn runs great shelters, but the less time you can be there, the better.
That's right. And hopefully we'll get to talking a little bit about the problems with even using the housing vouchers. Once you get a housing voucher, big problems. So Doug, you and I worked closely together when you were COO of CUCS. And one of the projects that Doug and I worked on together was getting a drop-in center opened on 14th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues. And it took years and years and years, but it finally opened just a few weeks ago. And I'll let you talk about it, Doug, but that is going to be one of these tools in the outreach workers toolkits. So situated in Community Ward 2, right between the Village and Chelsea. The people who are the long time street people who are living on the street and they're not going to go to Bellevue. This is an opportunity to get them inside into a drop-in center with meals, comfortable chairs, place to sleep, place to take a shower. That's the golden opportunity to get them connected to services, to mental health treatment, to social work. And Doug, you worked on that for many years.
Yeah, it was, I was tilting at windmills. It was, you know, the concept that I came up with was, you know, we were asked to site a drop-in center south of 14th Street because there was a clear need just for respite, right? From a humanitarian standpoint, from a social impact standpoint, from a common sense utility standpoint, giving someone a place that they can go to the bathroom that's not on the street or your doorstep, giving someone a place to sit and catch a nap that's not on the ground over a grate or in the subway, giving them a chair that's comfortable where they can elevate their legs. Street homeless individuals have heart disease, diabetes, comorbidity. Sitting up and sleeping causes edema, swelling in the legs, complicates their very many medical health issues. Giving someone a place to take a shower, right? These are just common sense things that the drop-in center we built were designed to provide in addition to meals. And then you do that and you leverage the opportunity to engage them with services. Case managers, social workers, psychiatrists, doctors, all there to meet their needs, to meet them where they are. And this was where I really excited, we also had the opportunity to co-locate some safe haven beds. And Shane was talking about the low threshold model for transitional housing for street homeless individuals. So you try to get them inside and you try to keep them inside, all right? And what we're talking about on this panel, and we've all jumped around and alluded to it in different ways, is we're talking about the dichotomy between housing and no housing. That's it, right? Do we want to develop transitional housing that can help keep families together? Christine spoke about the fact that you're actually not allowed to be street homeless if you're a family. So what happens is if you're street homeless in your family, you don't make the positive choice to go inside. They take your children away. Yep. And then you're a single individual in shelter. Great story. CUCS operated 350 Lafayette, a historic women's mental health shelter on the Lower East Side, Lafayette Street, in a building that was at one point an animal hospital. News articles and stories about this program and its place in the community go back into the 60s. And when we lost that building because it was bought by a developer, the community stepped up and advocated for us to keep it. A real success. But I was at DHS, and I was touring the facility with an elected official. I can't remember who it was, and they asked the women in the facility if they had children, and almost all of them raised their hands. This wasn't a single adult shelter. This was a family shelter. Just the kids weren't there. Right? So we're talking about the choice between housing and unhousing. Transitional housing is a necessity as a city. Or we're going to have people on the streets. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Yeah, so you are no longer with CUCS. You've embarked on your own venture to build shelter housing, right?
Housing, transitional and permanent housing, the same things I was doing at CUCS.
Yeah. So now that you're sort of untethered from being at the agency, I really want to ask you what the city, what's not working that's happening now that needs to change? What did you see in your many years on the inside that needs to change?
So between 2000 and 2018, New York City lost 459 inpatient psychiatric beds.
Yeah.
And the city population has grown over that time, right? And the need has not shrunk. So where are those people being served? Folks that are in need of inpatient psychiatric services are being served in our city's homeless shelters. And it's not the appropriate place to do it. Yeah, we should have psychiatric services and behavioral health and primary care in our shelters, because as Christine also rightly mentioned, people aren't going to go outside to get them. But there are so many New Yorkers with the level of need that are trying to get those services in shelter, in transitional housing, or at Rikers,
Right.
where they shouldn't be,
Yeah.
right? Where they should be getting them inpatient. And by having those folks in transitional housing, it means that the case managers, the security workers, the social workers, the psychiatrists are a disproportionate of their attention and energy is going to maintaining safety for the rest of the population and taking care of those incredibly high need individuals and dragging down the efficiency of the rest of the system, right? And so those are the folks that have a disproportionate impact on the facility, on the staff, making it hard to retain staff, high staff turnover. It makes folks like the people who are on this, who are all of you who are attending, concerned about, why do I have a shelter in my neighborhood? I don't want to have a shelter in my neighborhood. So that displacement is a problem, and it can be solved, right? But right now, WIN, CUCS, Breaking Ground, Care for the Homeless, BRC, all these great organizations are being asked to do something that they really shouldn't be. They're doing their best because there's nobody else to do it, but it's a problem.
You're right about that. And it's been a conscious choice by our government to not provide inpatient psychiatric services because they are expensive and they're not reimbursable by Medicaid. And that's something that
the math is.
Yeah, it's something that I and others have been working on. Inpatient residential facilities with psychiatric services or with more than 16 beds were expressly prohibited from getting Medicaid reimbursement in the 1964 Social Security Act by Lyndon Johnson. And that's something that we've been working really hard on, getting the state to apply for a waiver for that, because we have not only the number of beds we've lost, but we have nonprofits trying to open new inpatient facilities, and many of them are alternatives to incarceration, because over half the people in Rikers Island right now have mental health issues.
Yeah, that's where they're getting their psychiatric services, Matt, on Rikers. Right.
Doug, what about the problems that you experienced trying to get Paul's Place, the drop-in center, open? What is the system a mess in that respect, trying to get, if we can't get a drop-in center open over years and years, is that a big problem?
Yeah, I mean, so Paul's Place, ran into some roadblocks that are very unique to the situation, building through COVID, some problems unique to the actual physical plant that we had to get over. But I've developed permanent supportive housing, beautiful 117 unit buildings in Harlem and other programs around the city. And the problem is always the same, which is that we're not having an open conversation about the fact that we need to cite these programs everywhere. That homelessness and poverty is a citywide problem can have citywide solutions. We've made shelter a bad word, and we've allowed people to conflate permanent transitional housing for poor folks with transitional housing. So all of this is, compounds where the city, and I was guilty of it when I was with the city. We're always behind the ball trying to add capacity. And so we're often adding not so great capacity. On the family side, biggest tragedy I see is when we add capacity that's taking what would otherwise be units of permanent housing in the community and turning them into shelter, right? That we're not being planned for, we're not up far ahead of the curve enough to make sure that we're meeting demand with quality, and we're putting on things, that we're finding in November to meet the December crush, or of street home because it gets cold, and the single cell system is going to spike, or it's April and we're scrambling because school is going to get out and we're going to have a rush of family applications for shelter. So being planful, building the kind of capacity that we want, and being unapologetic and proud about it and making it quality is a problem, and it's solvable. And so that's what I'm going to try to do.
Eric, if I can just add, and I agree with everything Doug just said, is, what he just said at the end was, that this is the plan, but it'll take a while. You know what I mean? And what we really need is the mayor to say, we can solve this problem. It may take a decade, but if we put the right plan in place, we can solve this problem. And I know the people who've Zoomed in tonight want to know how to help. There's so many great progressive groups in the 3rd district and citywide. Push them to make homelessness, to make siting shelters, siting supportive housing part of our progressive agenda in New York, because it isn't. And people get away with attacking and villainizing and criminalizing homeless people and still get endorsed by, the Working Families Party or other progressives. We have to put a stop to that. It is not okay
You're stealing
to attack
my
homeless people.
talking point. You just stole my talking point.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm just kidding.
And I got a question for the whole panel. Bill de Blasio increased spending for DHS and homelessness by billions and billions of dollars. Where did all that money go? And did it make a difference or not? I would love to hear what
it went to the landlords. It went to the landlords, most of it, right? So, they wanted to open shelters in neighborhoods that didn't have them and in upper income neighborhoods, which I support. But the way they build and develop shelters, which I won't go into all of the mishigash of, but basically it's for-profit developers building the shelters, and they get rent money from the city. And so we opened 2 shelters in Park Slope, Gowanus. They were supposed to be market rate housing. The developers said, we can make more money if we operate shelters, which is a travesty if you think about it. And they got more money in rent than any shelter in the history of the city. That's where most of the money went, in my opinion.
Shane, go
I
ahead.
will note though that, and there was a significant increase. I don't have the numbers at hand, but in our outreach teams and in our outreach, up to probably 600 plus on outreach side, and the establishment on DHS side of a fairly robust homeless outreach crisis response team that entails people going out in the field, doing real-time placements, and nurses. And, the current mayor is obviously recognizing this, and I understand the need for all of it. What everybody has said, particularly around mental health care and medical care. And we're certainly trying to reinvest in the drop-in centers and ensuring that there's care on site for people, so that there's certainly linkages all of our sites have with area providers. But for those individuals who need care, but do not need that higher level of care, but are still in profound need, this whole street model is to provide access in real time. And so there is a pretty robust investment. And then, the current mayor, there's certainly an 170 million a year investment in additional transitional to get us to about 4,000 beds. So under de Blasio, there certainly was, but on the outreach side, I think there was a focus late on us and on serving the individuals on the street.
Thanks, Doug.
I also easily documented another fact, what both Shane and Christine said is true. A lot of money went to really, really duplicative administrative costs when they attempted the ham-handed merger of DHS and HRA. And these records are public. They created so many second, double, $100,000, $200,000 civil service positions, creating, duplicative services, doing the same jobs in different buildings. And it was wasteful, and not only did it not add value, it created inefficiencies. One of the biggest tragedies of the de Blasio administration's handling of homeless housing is that one of the keys is just making the buses run on time, like just doing the basic things well, right? It's like picking up garbage, or I hate to use that analogy, but you need to have a system and make sure that everybody is where they're supposed to be at the time they're supposed to be there. And they couldn't do that well. And they lost the thread. And that has taken, they started to get that back towards the end of the administration, and they've made tremendous strides, but that was a big problem. And part of that was, that ham-handed attempt to merge two agencies that litigation decades ago told us had to be separate.
Interesting.
Can I
Jacquelyn?
chime in on the finances piece of this? Because I think that we are spending a lot of money on homelessness right now. And I think that the frustration that many people feel is that the city has been spending money to manage the crisis instead of to end it. And that's, I don't necessarily think that right-sizing budgets for underfunded shelter providers is necessarily a bad thing, because I've seen firsthand in our monitoring role of the shelter system what happens when shelters are not adequately funded. And the reality is that creates a lot of issues for homeless New Yorkers, right? We want to have a social services system that is well supported and that is not, dealing with budget cuts that are going to deprive homeless New Yorkers of necessary services and supports, and all of the things that Christine had mentioned earlier are part of an adequate shelter system. But I think the frustration is that the right to shelter is so important, and it is a vital part of our safety net, but we need to do a much better job as a city at reducing the lengths of stay in shelter and making them a short-term emergency solution rather than having people languish in shelters for more than 500 days on average, right? We need to actually move people into permanent housing as quickly as possible. And that's the morally right thing to do, but it's also the fiscally responsible thing to do. And I think that the biggest failure of the de Blasio administration, in my mind, is that they had a really siloed city hall where there was the homelessness side of city hall and the housing side of city hall, and the housing plan that Mayor de Blasio was following throughout his entire tenure was not actually designed to reduce homelessness. And he was creating so-called affordable housing that wasn't affordable to the people who needed it most. And we saw the impact of that with increasing lengths of stay in shelter and increasing costs of an ever-growing shelter system. And I think that this administration has said that they recognize that homelessness is a housing problem, but we've also seen some of these persistent issues with bureaucratic delays and a lack of ambition when it comes to building the type of permanent housing that we need. So we need this administration to go further as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's get to people's questions. Does public real estate exist to build SROs or other forms of permanent housing? It seems that real estate right now is simply too valuable to build much new housing for the homeless. Doug.
So the land exists. It does. I've built on it, and it's a great resource. However, in order to develop a piece of city-owned land for permanent housing, you have to go through a very lengthy ULURP process. And community boards and individual council members have the opportunity and the power to effectively kill any project that actually has a beneficial, could have a beneficial impact on the city at large. And We've talked about it at length, and I don't see a solution in sight, but it is a problem, and it prevents these projects. It stops them in their tracks, and it makes them difficult and hard to even undertake or contemplate.
ULURP is the uniform land use review procedure that board has to get, it goes to the community board for advisory opinion, it goes to the borough president for advisory opinion, it goes to city planning for a vote, it goes to the council for a vote, then back to city planning. And it is an important.
And then to the mayor.
And then to the mayor. And, it's important that communities have a say in how in the planning of their communities. How do you balance that with the need, the emergency that we're facing, the need to move forward with the creation of housing of all kinds? It's one of the issues that we're really struggling with right now as a city.
But I think that part of that is also why these kinds of panel discussions are so important, because I think we need to demystify homelessness and get the message out there that we need permanent housing to solve homelessness, right? I think that there are too many community members who oppose shelters in their neighborhoods, and then they also oppose housing that could reduce the need for shelters in their neighborhood. And we need to move beyond that NIMBY debate, because it's not helping address the crisis. And, Christine mentioned that we have, on top of the lack of affordable housing, we've also seen an increase in new arrivals to the city, many of whom are ending up in the shelter system. And we need to be thinking much more holistically about how do we address the housing needs that we have today and that we will have tomorrow in the city. And that's why we at the coalition have been calling for the administration to build at least 6,000 apartments per year specifically for homeless households, and 6,000 apartments per year for extremely low income households, because even though that's about triple the production that they've been doing in recent years, that scale of production is so necessary to actually reverse these trends that we've been seeing.
Thank you. Is it true that, this is a question about street homelessness, is it true that unless a homeless individual is perceived by two psychiatric professions to be an immediate threat to themselves or others, they cannot be put into a facility against their will? That's a question from one of our attendees.
Can I?
Sure, go ahead,
Yeah,
Doug.
you can go, Doug.
So the removal procedure gives an outreach.
We lost Doug.
Oh, lost your audio. There you go.
Yeah, he is.
You're
Am I
back.
back?
Yep.
Sorry about that. Statute allows outreach teams, authorized outreach teams and a psychiatric professional to order the removal of a person deemed to be a risk of harm to themselves or others. That one professional can ask that an ambulance be summoned and take that person to an inpatient psychiatric bed for evaluation. There, the psychiatrist or the staff on site also perform an assessment to determine whether or not that person is to be admitted. So that's the two-step. So they can be removed from the street by the outreach team who have known this person, has worked with them, have seen them over time, and can know that they are decompensating, they're in a moment of crisis, and they need to be removed. Or if they're at a shelter or a transitional housing site, and the staff there says, you know what, Doug needs a higher level of intervention right now. But when they get to the psych ED, emergency department, because of the shortage of beds that we talked about earlier,
A very high
they
bar.
may not be room.
Yeah.
There's a very, very high bar. And so they may be sent back.
Eric, I just
You need
want
to
to,
stay, then there's other processes. If you get into medication over objection and things of that sort, there's other legal processes once you're inside. So it doesn't, even admitting doesn't guarantee long-term placement, but it.
Right.
look, and people may say the process for a 72-hour hold or whatever should be changed, and that's that may or may not be a conversation to have. But just because you don't have a house or a home doesn't mean you should be treated differently than a housed person who is perceived to be mentally ill. And that's an important, conversation to remember, because all of the problems we've talked about tonight, opioids, mental illness, we haven't really talked about it, but domestic violence, all the things we've mentioned also happen to people who have homes, right? In the apartment buildings we all live in. And we just should remember that in how we think about those New Yorkers who don't have homes.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just want to say that the processes that are in place for involuntary treatment are designed to strike a balance between, the need for the state to essentially override someone's civil liberties and the reality that every person should have certain civil liberties, right? So there has to be a high bar, not just because, they're trying to triage who really needs a bed, but it's also because that is a very extreme step. And I think that what we found at the coalition is that many people who are seeking care, even on a voluntary basis, are not able to access it. So I think that too often our discussion of mental illness begins and ends with the standards around involuntary treatment, when that's missing the larger point about the lack of access to care, even on a voluntary basis.
That's right, Jeff.
Mental illness does not equal violent behavior. And I should just note, we've all seen extraordinary transformative changes of what happens when people just come inside and get the services they need. And just the fact of coming inside, having a place to rest, having a door to shut, that can do amazing things and go amazing ways. And we've all seen absolute black and white changes. Right. So there's a lot of other steps before you get to involuntary removal. And again, that just gets you into a hospital and maybe treatment, but there are a lot of other things that can be done.
Yeah. My critique is not of the standard or the process. It's just about the supply. That's whether it's AOT, IMT teams, or inpatient psychiatric services, or outpatient psychiatric services available to low-income New Yorkers. It's just a supply problem. And I see that supply problem playing out in the way that decisions are being made.
Right, and the continuum of care, from the moment someone's brought to health and hospitals or emergency room, there is a huge absence of capacity all along the continuum of care. Dr. Mitch Katz, the head of H&H, told me that a huge drop-off is when they have to release people who've been brought there having a psychotic episode, right? They're in the hospital and they're getting discharged into shelters or the street when they should really be going into long-term housing situation. And I believe that a lot of the psychiatric residential facilities, I think a lot of people would stay there willingly. A lot of people go to the hospital over and over again because that's where they're getting cared for. They're going to the emergency room willingly over and over and over again because they're getting cared for there. And I think that if we can manage to create this capacity through the continuum of care, we wouldn't have to involuntarily admit lots of people if we had humane, comfortable home-like settings with psychiatric services.
And Eric, with our clients, when they are taken to the psychiatric hospital because there's been a suicide attempt or suicidal ideations or something else, I have to tell you, very, very rarely do they get kept at the hospital. And that's something that their parents and Wynn would want. I'm not saying, a different type of situation. In fact, only about 1% of all of the family members who are in the family shelters citywide end up getting inpatient care when they need it. So the shortage, is very, very profound, particularly for beds or psychiatrists who work with children.
Here's a question from someone who says, I work at Fountain House, and on a daily basis, we refer many people to safe havens, but are told they need to live on the street for 10 months to get a priority. Is that accurate?
No, that's not true. No. And we are actually making, yes, that is not true at all. Absolutely. And we can certainly follow up with Fountain House, and I think we are.
There was a rule about what are they misconstruing? There's something where you do have to be on the street. For a lifetime.
The really only criteria is just that someone's in the street homeless. I mean, that's really the criteria. Historically, safe havens, the original model was really based around chronicity. It was really based on the idea those are really for the most vulnerable individuals out on the street. And chronicity was one way of getting to it. Chronicity being somebody's out in the street for 9 months out of the last 2 years. But knowing that probably indicates a much longer homeless history. And that was when the resources were very small. As we've started expanding the resources of safe havens and drop-in centers and safe haven stabilization beds, we have the ability to make appropriate clinical assessments and put people where they need to be to get the services they need, regardless of chronicity. If chronicity is an issue, great, we can get somebody into a site where they need higher levels of service. But no, 10 months is absolutely not the rule. If somebody is street homeless and wants to come inside, we can get them inside.
I want to agree with Shane, though. It is incredibly important that safe havens access to safe havens continue to flow through the outreach teams, right? So that's the distinction between the regular transitional housing system and safe havens. Transitional housing, you present at 30th Street, you present at one of the women's intake centers, and you automatically assigned to a bed. It could be anywhere. Whereas the safe havens distinguish themselves from the from mainstream transitional housing system, referrals only. And so there is a barrier. There is a hurdle to clear in order to get access to the safe haven system, and it's an important one.
Here's a question about.
All right, can I just say, Doug
Sure.
just mentioned intake, and on the family side, the intake is called PATH, and it's in the Bronx. And one of the reasons people, and I assume this is similar on the single side, but at PATH in the Bronx, the staff are called fraud investigators. What kind of a message does that send, right? You're there with your child, your 2 garbage bags full of stuff, because you're only allowed to bring 2 garbage bags, and you have to meet the fraud investigator. Well, that name is accurate, because these individuals work you over to prove, like, that's a nice sweater. Oh, what's it made of? How'd you have the money to get it? You were staying with your aunt. Doesn't she love you? Let's call your aunt. So one of the things, Eric's colleague has introduced a bill, I know Eric is a sponsor, to require that all the PATH workers get trauma-informed care, but that is a part of the process that sends people away, and it sends them, I believe, back to the street if they're single, and if they're families, I worry it sends them back to a batterer.
Yeah, so many of the folks who are caught in this cycle of homelessness have just been treated horribly their entire lives from the time they were kids. They've been treated terribly. And that is just perpetuating this horrible problem.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question about the shelter safety in the shelters. Why do so many homeless folks consider the shelters unsafe?
Yeah, I can start with this one, because we've done, this is a complaint that we hear regularly as the court-appointed independent monitor of the shelter system. And I think that, when you talk to folks who are unsheltered on the streets, many times they have experienced the main shelter system, and they say that they don't want to go back to that conventional shelter system because they didn't feel safe there. And it's often, I think, the design of the shelters itself that can contribute to these feelings of danger. So the shelter system for single adults, setting aside, safe havens and stabilization beds, but the main shelter system is predominantly congregate in nature. And that means that you, as a single adult, might be placed in a dorm with a dozen strangers, and your beds are 3 feet apart, and you have your own locker, but you don't really have much privacy. And I think that is concerning to people even without the added danger of a continuing airborne pandemic, right? So there were some people who left the congregate shelters at the height of the pandemic because they were worried about contracting the virus that causes COVID-19. The city did, under the de Blasio administration, move many people from those congregate dorm style shelters into hotels temporarily. And providers did surveys of folks who were in those hotels and found that when people had a single or double occupancy room, yes, they were safer from COVID-19, but they also just felt safer in general because they felt like they could sleep and trust that someone wasn't going to approach them in the middle of the night. They didn't have to worry about, living essentially in a public space. It was more so that they had that sense of privacy and dignity that so many of us who are stably housed take for granted. And I think that that's why we are encouraging the administration to take those lessons from the success of the safe haven models that tend to have more privacy and the success of the hotels during the height of the pandemic, and to shift the shelter system so that it is giving people more privacy, including single occupancy rooms. And also just, again, it comes back to permanent housing. People who might not be interested in coming indoors to any type of a shelter because of bad experiences in the past would usually accept the offer of permanent housing and a place of their own. But because of that lack of affordable housing, people have to jump through all these hoops. So that's really where the focus should be.
There's a question about, there's a number of questions about the high cost of housing and rents. Here's someone who says, we're a family of 3. It's been almost impossible to find an affordable apartment. Who controls all these rents? It seems like everyone is free to set the rent they want, which is extremely high. Are there any laws or guidelines? Another person says, how can the government keep rent stable? Why could we have a moratorium on evictions and now go on to these astronomical rent heights? So I'll start with that. There is a bill in Albany that is, it's referred to as just cause legislation that would, in New York State, set a limit on what the rent increases could be for even market rate leaseholders. And it would require a landlord to have a reason to evict you, right? And these are protections that exist elsewhere. They don't exist in New York. But even if we did that, and I support that, and I think we need to do that, even if we did that, and hopefully we will, we still have a huge mismatch between the number of people who need apartments and the number of apartments available. So we really do have to create more housing of all kinds, formerly homeless housing, supportive housing, very low income, middle income, and market rate housing. Part of the problem with a lot of these buildings that have been going up, because people see, well, so what do you mean? I see cranes all over the place. They're building, so a lot of these buildings they'll have like 10 apartments in the whole building. That tower, one of the towers on Central Park South, it's got like 100 apartments in the whole building because each floor is an apartment, right? So I've been working on ways to disincentivize that kind of density. We need people to build rental buildings with studios and 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms to really help absorb some of the demand. There's antiquated zoning. There's a minimum apartment size for buildings that prohibits people who are building buildings from building a certain number of studio apartments, right? And people want to live alone, so maybe some buildings should have a lot of studios. So these are just some of the things that we need to do as a city. And I'm a big believer in comprehensive planning instead of these one-off projects where we have this huge fight over 1 building with 100 apartments. We need to all sit down as a city council, as a city with the mayor and community boards, and plan for the future growth of New York City in a way that accounts for school capacity. So we're thinking ahead. Where are we going to need school capacity? Where are we going to need parks, water infrastructure, transportation infrastructure? We don't do comprehensive planning in New York. That's something I'm really pushing for. And it's been shown time and time again that if you increase the supply of housing, it has a stabilizing effect on rents. And we saw that play out during the pandemic when so many people left the city. We had a real-time experiment took place in front of us. What happens when you decrease demand? The rents went way down for that great little time, but they're back up and they're higher than ever before. I'm gonna let the panel weigh in on that.
Yeah, I think you said so much that is so important. And I'll just add on that I think that often, like almost everyone in New York agrees that we have an affordable housing crisis and that rents are too high, right? That's not a controversial statement. Where you get into the controversy is what tools are the best to rectify that? And too often people talk about either demand side solutions like housing vouchers and tenant protections, or supply side solutions in the sense of what the council member was talking about regarding building more housing that's actually affordable to the people who need it. And my response is we need both, right? This crisis is so big and the gap between incomes and rents is so big that we need those robust tenant protections. We need good cause eviction. We need housing vouchers that actually work and source of income discriminations that are actually enforced. And then we also need to be making sure that the housing that is being built in the city, and especially the housing that's being built with city subsidy and with our tax dollars, is affordable to the people who actually need it the most. I mean, the vacancy rate for apartments renting under $900 is less than 1%. So for people who don't have any subsidies, people who are on fixed incomes, our seniors, people with disabilities, families where it's a single parent and they're working a minimum wage job, they virtually cannot find affordable housing in New York City. And we need to be doing an all of the above strategy in order to address that.
Thank you so much. We can't have a city where you either have a rent stabilized apartment or you're a person of great wealth, right? We can't have a city. We have to have a city where in the you can go out and find an apartment for rent at a reasonable price. We're going on an hour and a half, so I'm gonna wrap us up. I know we didn't get to all your questions. I apologize, everyone. And before I thank our panelists, I just want to show this chart, which is homelessness in New York City since 1983. And, you know, this is what keeps me up at night when I think about these trend lines continuing. What kind of New York are we going to have if those trend lines continue and we live in a city with 100,000, 125,000, 100? How can we have a city? So this is an emergency, and the good news is that we have really, really great people like those of you on the panel working on it. And someone asked in the questions, they asked, you know, what keeps you all going? And I sometimes wonder that about people in the field of homelessness too, because as difficult as it is, I get to work on all kinds of other things. It's real tough work to be in all day, every day. So I want to thank all of you.
Eric, can I share just a story quickly?
Sure.
That was so heartwarming to me, and I want just everyone to know it. So as I mentioned, with the asylum seekers that we have now at Wynn, who literally have nothing, right? The clothes on their backs, no food stamps, nothing. So the traditional Wynn clients at one of our shelters, one of the homeless people went around and collected the clothes that their other shelter residents didn't need and left a box in the lobby full of donated clothes by people living in shelter for the refugee families. That's what keeps you going.
Wow. Boy, well, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you here. I love looking at this. I think I'm a little bit sick of Zoom like the rest of us, but the cool thing about Zoom is I can look out there and see all your faces. Some of my favorite people right here, all in one place. I really want to thank everyone for being part of this. And I do feel optimistic about the future. In spite of all these challenges, I think that we're at a real point and an inflection point in the city. I think we have a great opportunity to make a great difference. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.